as we give a huge warm welcome to Jeff Pulver, aka WA2Bot.
Thank you. I'm so grateful to be here. It's a wonderful opportunity. I'm so happy to be welcomed as you are embracing me. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us today. Facilitating this talk on the future of the internet will be one of our senior business analysts, and if I may add, one of our most beautiful business analysts, Rahul Indrachapa.
Thank you, Ed. Great to be here.
Thanks, Rahul. Now, if I can ask everyone in the audience today to please ensure their mics are muted, their cameras are switched off, and also I would direct you to looking at the chat box now. There will be a link for pigeonholelive.com in which you can submit any questions you have throughout this talk. The power is then with you to upvote those questions that you want answered. So with that, I think we should dive straight in. So Rahul, over to you.
Thanks, As. Hi, Jeff. Happy to have you here today. Given you are focusing on the advancement of up-and-coming futuristic technologies like Web 5, we are excited to pick your brain on these technologies and how they are going to impact the future. If time permits, we will have a Q&A session at the end, where Jeff will answer some questions on Pigeonhole Live that have the highest votes. Okay, let's start. Jeff, could you explain to us what Web3 is?
Well, Web3 in the context of the other webs, we'll just say it's the blockchain internet. There's a lot about Web3, which is in the that I look at in my mind space. Web3 started when Bitcoin happened in 2009, really came to life in 2014 with Vitalik's white paper, came into existence in 2015. And for some people, that's a world of the internet which they know. It's an internet which has digital currencies, digital assets. It's fundamentally all around the blockchain. And it's for some people where the future is and where the present is. It's also where a lot of people are not yet. And so Web3 though is definitely where we're at for many people. The blockchain internet, not necessarily the internet. If you've been on the internet for 25 years, it may not be the same internet that you grew up with. But for people who are just coming online today, it's the internet that they know.
So yeah, what was missing in Web 2 that pushed us out to this paradigm?
One of the biggest challenges in Web 2 was managing state, being able to understand if you're going to do business that you have to be able to manage transactions and understand in the flow of business, in the way that business takes place, being able to understand where are people clicking, what are people doing. When the internet first happened, it came from the educational world, it came from the research world, and commerce was not something that was necessarily core to it. In the mid to late 90s, there were hints about digital currencies, DigiCash, and other platforms and CyberCash came to life in terms of ways to transfer value. But what the implementation of Bitcoin did in 2009 is it actually provided a means to transfer value across the internet. So what was missing? It's not so much what was missing as what we could do. But for some people, it was state. It's managing, being able to handle state. That's why today you still see so many cookies being used on websites, being able to try to figure out where things are at. For others, it was the ability to have, let's say, absolute certainty of value being transferred, or for that matter, data being stored. But again, it's very open what was missing, because for some people nothing was missing. It's more like, okay, this is what we have now. No one asked for it. They didn't ask for it, but there it is. And one of the biggest challenges we have with the Web3 is yes, go ahead.
If I may, can we talk about the decentralization? So we heard a lot about decentralization of applications with Web3. Could you explain a bit more about it?
Sure. Well, fundamental to Web 2, for that matter, when the internet first happened, the domain name service that was introduced as one of the core applications of the internet is decentralized. There's no one server that it's dependent on that DNS will continue to live due to the fact of lack of one single point of failure. That is probably today still the most popular decentralized application. The whole idea of Web3 also is decentralization when it comes to control. There's a concept of DAOs or what we call decentralized autonomous organizations, where groups of people don't need to be managed, where people, the community itself can vote, and those votes can take action, and those actions can be implemented through things called smart contracts. That all said, decentralization itself is a way of being, but it's not necessarily the only way to be. And decentralization runs up against a lot of regulatory issues. To be anonymous and autonomous for some is what they want. Autonomous in business is difficult to achieve. In closed communities, it works quite well. And decentralization is beautiful if you want to vote, if you want to anonymously or autonomously vote on something, talk about something, not necessarily get attribution. And decentralization offers the ability for the endpoints to come to life and do magical things, but at the same time, it comes at a price. And so some organizations work great as decentralized organizations, but not all. And again, that's sort of why, all or nothing, like we must be in Web 2, we must be in Web 3, that mind space doesn't always necessarily work out to what people want to see.
Yeah. So Jeff, in other words, blockchains are a kind of a distributed ledger. Is that the case?
Yes, but assuming people know what a ledger is, but yes, it's a blockchain offers us the ability to have, again, a ledger in the sense that information is being written into a database. It's not one single database. That database is being replicated all over the world, so that if you change that database, that change is also replicated all around the world. So what's in theory, what's special about blockchain is that it's immutable. That there should be an implied ability to trust that if you create an entry in that blockchain, it's visible to everybody. If you change that entry, it's visible to everybody. So you will forever be seen. So anything that's written to the blockchain is there, quote, forever. That's different than using traditional databases where you don't necessarily have the ability to audit and to track and do things. And so that the ledgers are distributed. There is no single point of failure theoretically. And as we're learning, of course, there are people who take advantage of these things and they exploit it. But theoretically, distributed ledgers are core to Web3 as much as blockchain is, yes, because it's all very much the same.
Great. So Jeff, going by what you said, blockchain seems to be a key component of Web3. Does this mean that blockchain was invented in tandem with Web3?
No, not necessarily at all. There is Web3 is a marketing term. It's not a technical term. Blockchain itself, and there are people I've met who would say that concepts of blockchain go back to the 1980s and before. The various people, various cyberpunks would talk about the need for blockchain literally before the internet was commercial. In fact, when the internet was still very much on the educational side. The advent of this branding of Web3 is to differentiate where we were. And it's funny for those people who may have been on the internet in the 90s and the 2000s up until yesterday, they may not realize they lived through the Web 1 and Web 2 world. We were just using the internet for what it was good for. In the early days, we put up websites that looked like brochures, then became interactive, and then they became super powerful because based on the inefficiencies of what was, people innovated and did things that were never practical or possible. And so there were patches and ways to be interactive 20 years ago. Today, the Web3 internet, which not only has decentralization and blockchain, it also changes the way you do business because the most popular way of doing commerce in Web3 is through wallets. Now, if a consumer hears what a wallet is, they think that they're going to their pocket. They don't realize it's an application that typically connects to a Chrome browser that lets them move digital assets from one form to another. Like MetaMask being the most popular such example of that, that turns your browser into a node, into a blockchain, which is mind-boggling to think about how difficult that is. And that's the easy way of doing things, and that wasn't easy 3 years ago. But today there are passports into Web3. The point is that there's the way we're used to doing things and the way things are in Web3, and it shouldn't be a take it or leave it approach. The popularity of NFTs in 2021 brought forth around the world a term called NFTs. But I promise you that while NFT might be a very trendy word, most people don't know that it stands for a non-fungible token. And for that matter, people don't necessarily know what tokens are. They don't know what fungible is and non-fungible. It's a term. It's a word. And several years ago, the most popular misunderstood words of the year were blockchain and Bitcoin. Last year, it's NFTs. And but the reality is that these are signs of where future could go. And my approach, and the reason why we mentioned Web 5 at the beginning of this conversation, is people think we're in the Web 3 internet. I don't believe Web 3 is our future. I believe that we're in a transition state, which we're going to talk about, because we're dealing with many things at the same time.
Yeah, Jeff, Web 5, that's an interesting topic. We will get back to that in a second. Before that, you touched upon the wallets. Could you explain a bit more about the wallets to the audience?
Yeah, I actually wish that the people who created this Web 3 marketing were more explicit. We'll call a wallet is sort of in the same way that you have money perhaps in your pocket, or perhaps not, maybe through a debit card at some financial institution. A wallet is your platform to go in and out of digital currencies, move digital assets from one blockchain to another, and it's an ability to empower payments. Wallets are essential for when you're using something called smart contracts. Now, if you're not familiar with smart contracts, it might be a little misleading to hear the word smart contracts, because smart contracts are neither smart nor are they contracts. But a so-called smart contract is a living piece of code that connects to what's known as an oracle that determines whether an event happened or not, and based on that event happening or not, a transaction will happen based on the code. So, for example, if you have three friends and you're having a friendly bet for a dollar that your favorite team is going to win the day before, and you set up a so-called smart contract, you could actually go to a source of truth, which would be a database. Did that team win or lose, or was it a tie? And based on those conditions, all of a sudden you may have maybe 50 cents richer or not, or maybe a photograph that you took got shared with two friends because of that action. Smart contracts are not necessarily tied to financial transactions, but they are tied to wallets. They are tied to events that take place. And the idea of smart contracts is tied very much to Web3, very much tied to what Vitalik's white paper that brought forth Ethereum. Smart contracts exist in many other blockchains too. But the ability to write code that has a life to it, that allows actions to be taken and independently verified, that's a wow. That's something that did not exist in the original internet, never thought of something that was needed, yet it offers tremendous new value to those people who are building systems and thinking about infrastructure, not from a legacy perspective, but more like, gee, now I can do this. What does this enable us to do? And it opens up a wide world of opportunity.
So, Jeff, the smart contracts, are they just a bit of code, or are they actually real-world applications of it? Is there anything special about it? Yeah.
Well, yes, it depends upon the blockchain you're talking about, and it also depends upon the context. There are contracts I've seen that are tied to a smart contract, so you have a legal relationship, a legal obligation between one or more entities that are represented by a smart contract. And that smart contract has the ability, the authority to take action with consent based on who's participating. But in itself, a smart contract are lines of code typically written in one language. Again, for Ethereum, it'll be written in Solidity, but there are other languages that support smart contracts. And the idea is that it's for a purpose, right? It's code with purpose, take action in certain situations. The prelude to that very much could have been a signed agreement or a signed consent. There may or may not be something legally binding associated with those actions, but at the same time, smart contracts happen all the time. If you've heard about NFTs, and if you've ever bought an NFT or published an NFT, there was a smart contract involved in the publishing of the NFT, in the transfer of the NFT, in the transfer of digital assets behind the scenes. So to consumers, they don't necessarily need to know smart contracts exist, but to developers or anyone who's building the architecture, they need to know it, because we need sometimes many pieces of code written interact in a layered environment in order for the stuff to just work.
Yeah. So Jeff, there's a concept called immutability. that is linked with blockchains. Could you go a little bit more into it?
Well, again, there's depends upon where we're, there's one of the big things today in blockchain is same chain operability. Where people have been fascinated for a long time for cross-linking chains, for being able to take assets from one blockchain, move it to another. And then all of a sudden it became very fascinating just to be interoperable and building applications on the same blockchain. And there's a term also called DApps, which are distributed applications, which are applications that operate on a blockchain, again, to create value. There's also the concept of utility. That is, when you have a piece of code or you have something which is adding an incremental value, there's a value to it. A digital asset, for example, if you're using an NFT to give access to a group of fans to have special privileges to go backstage to hear an artist, or if you're a fan of an artist and you want to hear their music before it's published, or for that matter, if you want to just have a meet and greet, people use NFTs as gatekeeping tools, and those are utility functions. It's much like having a paywall, and you're paying money to pay for extra services, extra value. That's where NFTs are being used for access. That is. And there's code associated with doing that. It's not as simple as saying, gee, I have an NFT, I'm going to give you access to my webpage. There are pieces of code that talk to the chain that open up the ability to literally use that particular NFT as the authoritative source for access or non-access. This does open up lots of opportunities. It's also challenging because of inoperabilities. This industry is based a lot on open source. There's a lot of open source out there, meaning that you don't have to go out and start from scratch to create a project. In fact, a lot of these applications are all called projects, which comes from the Unix world. So there's a lot of developer talk, developer speak embedded in the culture of Web3, where if you're a software developer, you may get it immediately because this is your language. But if you're a consumer who just all of a sudden walks here using the internet, and now you don't relate it to being a developer, you might be really confused why all of a sudden you have to deal with all these other applications, interact with them in ways that don't make sense to you. And that's because we're at this crazy moment in time where for some people it's Web3 or bust. For other people, they're saying, enough of that. I like doing things the way I like doing them. And you wonder, well, what's going to happen? Why hasn't Web3 taken off? Some people say it's the so-called crypto winter we're in. But
so Jeff, if I may interject, what's the need for decentralization and the more open internet when what we have is working fine actually?
Well, the need for decentralization comes from people's desires to decentralize. There's some people, and when I say some, I'm talking about millions of people who live in certain worlds, who feel that from their philosophy, from their perspective of life, they don't want to be bound to one central authority. They want to be able to have access to and the freedom to go do things anonymously, autonomously, as much as they wish to, as if life was a video game and they're an avatar in the video game and they're not accountable necessarily for any actions. And so they want to be anonymous and autonomous, and they want to operate, in the ether of life. And that may work for some situations, may not work necessarily for all situations. Decentralization as a concept is directly in the face of government regulation. There are a lot of governments dealing with finance have regulations to protect consumers from being scammed. There's a lot of people, a lot of history of the last 200 years of people doing bad things, doing bad things, taking advantage of other people's innocence or lack of knowledge. And so decentralization as a whole, very interesting, very, very inspiring, very innovative. However, taking decentralization and going into an existing ecosystem like finance does require cooperation with authority and regulations. There's a term like KYC, which in banking means know your customer. And there are people who don't want to be KYC'd because they want to be anonymous and autonomous. But frankly, if you want to have an on-ramp or off-ramp, that is to say, you want to connect from your digital world, your digital life into your regular, your Web 1 life, your physical realm, you need a way to go from one world to the other, and those are through on-ramps or off-ramps, and typically you need to comply to through regulations so that you're properly identified. And so that's where you have a lot of infra fighting. But if you have, in some places, people don't use banks. There's a whole world of people that don't do banking traditionally anymore, where there are millions and millions of people unbanked. And so in the unbanked communities, decentralization is the way of life, and that's the way things are. And so it's a process that will continue to be a process. And I don't think, now that decentralization has become commercialized, deal with it, because it's definitely out there. And as long as people have good intentions, that's a beautiful thing. But if people are trying to do bad things, that's where there's conflict, because for protection purposes, more than anything else, that's where the level of interaction between centralization, decentralization, and management comes in. But if you owned a football team and you wanted to decentralize your ownership so the fans come in, that's wonderful. The fans can vote on many things, but I don't necessarily know if I want the fans to decide who my players should be and how much money I should spend on the players, and where we should be, making, what vendors we should be doing business with. There are things I'd put out for voting for the fans to vote in a decentralized way, but I don't necessarily want the fans, unless the fans collectively are better general managers than the people I can hire. I don't necessarily want the fans to actually run the team. People have experimented with this, and occasionally they are better than the people on the field, but a lot of times not so much. So I think there's a place for compromise, for coexistence, where we can take a lot of these concepts and bring forward a time where we take the best of both worlds, rather than a take it or leave it, all this or all that kind of world.
Yes. So looks like there are a lot of good example of the usage of the blockchains. So talking more about the people with good faith and bad faith, don't you think there would be like illegal activities that can be taken place using the blockchains? Because the same reason you mentioned, that we cannot know the customer and people cannot track that. So let's say in the dark web also, there could be things like, Silk Road and things like illegal things like that can take place.
Well, as we mentioned earlier today, the blockchain is theoretically anyway is immutable, so that every transaction can be traced. And luckily for the safety of the people of this world, that is true. And so a lot of illegal activities have been stopped and otherwise tracked, due to the fact that the blockchains are immutable. And if you are a smart blockchain detective, you may not know the person, but you can identify the wallet that the activities came through. And when you start going through that, even if you try to create hundreds of wallets to mask activities, it's all traceable. And with enough manpower or people power, anything becomes possible in terms of trying to track things down. Maybe not everybody gets tracked, but the big numbers get tracked. And then again, if it's associated with a bad activity, there are ways that people can access that information that perhaps won't be disclosed here, but it is available to be found. So the fact that your wallet represents an immutable transaction means that if you did something, it's out there to be discovered. And so it's not a game. It's more like, hopefully people live in a life of intention and purpose. And of course, if people have a specific purpose to defraud somebody, that's why we have regulations. That's why there are rules and regulations to do business, and people can opt to follow those rules or not follow those rules. If they choose not to follow those rules, there are going to be issues. I mean, the big thing about blockchain too is that we're moving in a world which is not necessarily understood. So there's going to be some things that are being done that are leading edge, that are not necessarily illegal, but the regulatory systems never considered it before. So that's where three words that I'm very familiar with come to mind: fear, greed, and disruption. So when you have an innovative system that is attacking the status quo, the legacy systems, the legacy operators are going to be fearful. They're also going to be greedy because they want to maintain the way the things are today, because that's the business they know. And they don't want to be disrupted by the innovation. Now, most of the time, ultimately, those legacy companies are either going to go out of business, or they're going to change themselves to take advantage of what happens because you're a disruptor. In the world that I came from, the world of voice on the internet, in fact, it was the innovation of voice over IP that changed the way that communication companies operate in the world today. There's not a single company in the world that was a legacy telco that doesn't today have a division where they're all operating digitally. They all adopted. In some countries, the regulation shifted. Like in America, I brought forth policy which there's actually have my name on an order at the FCC, which is why today, for example, many people in the States can freely use voice and video on the internet. That doesn't help the phone companies. But in 2004, I brought a petition forward to basically to save the innovation, and people listened. In banking right now, in finance, if there are people on the government side and on the institutional side that are looking to leverage these new technologies in ways that they never could before, not to do bad, but to do good, and then to understand what this represents so that the future that comes forward is one which everybody wins. And in international banking, there are rules and regulations to follow, and there's money transfers and stuff. And so there's, people are not saying no to this. They just want to understand, what does it mean? In some cases, they want to catch up so that whatever regulations that come forward, they're smart regulations. I've been fortunate to be an advisor to the government of Bermuda in fintech for the last 3 years. And I'll tell you that Bermuda, among other countries, they actually have created a digital sandbox where if you're involved in fintech and you want to understand regulation, the government of Bermuda has been very proactive in inviting companies to come to Bermuda to learn, to play, and to understand financial frameworks so that they could see what's possible. So, distributed ledgers, fintech, these are all great new growth opportunities. And the biggest growth opportunity is when you take blockchain and distributed ledgers and go out of fintech and go into any other marketplace, any other markets, which were today are traditionally being dominated by eBay, or let's say by Uber or Airbnb. You can actually take the same concepts of fintech and apply it in those markets, and those folks are not going to see it coming, and that will be completely disruptive to that.
Yes. So let's move on to the current state of things. Do you think the current crash of cryptocurrencies and a large chunk of NFT projects are losing a lot of their value in the last few months? This could expedite an early death to Web3, because cryptocurrencies and tokens are the beating heart of any Web3 application.
I don't know for sure. I can't speak for the millions of people that are involved, but certainly if greed is the only driver of innovation in this case, and the fact that the market's cooled off, yeah, people's interest cooled off too. But whether or not people are interested in projects does not take anything away from the innovation and the technology that was created and continues to evolve. Marketplaces like OpenSea may have seen a decline in the so-called value of the digital assets that are there, but it doesn't take away the fact that marketing strategies from corporations around the world now include NFTs as part of customer satisfaction programs. That what's shifting is the need to use digital tokens in terms of fan fulfillment platforms. That's shifted, and I don't think there's any going back to that. That, again, if there's not enough knowledge distributed to the consumer, people may be really confused what this is all about. And it may not be so interesting right now because of the so-called crypto winter, where market shifts and value goes down. But what is the utility? If the utility didn't go down, then it might just be a marketplace pricing issue, which in case, that's up to the companies to figure out what to price for services. But the technology itself didn't shift. If value is created, value is created. At what price, what level, that's up to the markets. In terms of the usefulness of this, again, if you're only in it to be greedy, if you're only in it to make to trade cryptocurrencies, I have nothing to say, because I don't trade crypto. However, if you're looking at the value creation by looking at the innovation that's possible, yes, I think that it's actually now is a wonderful time to innovate and to build and to create, but also to think about, rather than have a take it or leave it attitude that you're either on the Web3 train and you're entering my world or you're not. And that's where I think, that's why coexistence. So if I look at the future of the internet, We had the Web 1, Web 2 era, and then it's almost like that goes up against the Web 3, like they're butting each other. Because folks on the Web 1, Web 2, to the last 25 years, the internet hitting up to Web 3, they didn't know Web 3 was coming. They didn't see it. They're not represented by the demographic of the folks that came from the Ethereum circles. And so what happened is a lot of confusion. And a lot of people wanted to rapidly acquire knowledge in 2021 to figure out, okay, I don't want to be blindsided. I'm here. I want to do business. And it's those folks who came on board lately to catch up that now don't know what's going on. They don't know what to do. And my feeling is that what we're going to be actually the era so people think we're in the Web3 era. I actually think we're not. I actually think we're in the era of coexistence, which I'm labeling Web 4, because for me, Web 4 is all about coexistence. It's the fact that Web 3 will continue to evolve, and frankly, Web 2 is going to be around for a damn long time, because there's no reason for it not to, because it serves a lot of great business needs as is. So for people and companies that literally have spent millions and millions of dollars investing in their systems, for the most part, that works. If those companies want to rethink their infrastructure, their legacy, their architecture, and they want to build into the future, they can do that. But no one's going to say that there's end of life. It's not like we go that all of a sudden one operating system's being disabled and you now have to move to a new OS or else. So I think for a while we're going to have Web 3 innovations coexist with Web 2, and that period of time is what I label as Web 4. And when I look to Web 5, no, it's not Web 2 plus Web 3. But what Web 5 to me, yes.
Yeah, so Web 4 and Web 5, yeah, those let's get back to those in a second. So considering you are amongst the earliest adopters and advocates of Web 3, do you still believe that Web 3 is the future of the internet, or that would be Web 4 and Web 5?
Well, Web 3 is a future. We can't say it's not a future. If you asked me that question in 2017, I'd say yes. In 2017, Web 3 was a future. Not the future, a future. In 2021, I went all in and I thought, yes, this is the future. But I got blindsided by the buzz and forgot about the practicality of it. Today, I'll say that Web3 and all the fundamental concepts that Web3 has, which includes decentralization, wallets, smart contracts, the use of oracles, the ability to have access to sources of truth connected with immutable trust. Those are things which are going to continue into the future. The need for us to have digital assets to do business will continue into the future. I mean, one of the major driving forces of Web3 came from the gaming world. When gamers were online and they were playing a game and they acquired, while playing the game, certain assets for that game, they needed a way to transfer those assets from one player to the other. And that's how some of the cryptocurrencies came into form early on, or digital currencies, because players just needed an easy way to move. Like you and I are playing a game together, and all of a sudden you got a golden parachute. I want that golden parachute. Well, how do you transfer it to me? Well, in the game you can transfer it to me, but you're not going to give it to me for free. So how do I give you something in return? So a lot of games needed a way to have that currency associated with it. So we're going to continue evolving future forward, not forward back. So is Web3 the future? No, I think the future is a convergence of, and things that will happen as a hybrid, that the folks who brought Web3 into existence without any knowledge or experience of the past, plus the people from the past that say, oh, wow, this is pretty cool. And they see what Web3 offers, they will then start to think about and innovate things never before did they ever see. And that, to me, combining is the future. And it's much like in the innovation in the last almost 200 years of communications. In the last bit of time in communications, where radio comes out and then television happens, and people in the radio industry were afraid that television was going to disrupt them, and then the internet happens and people thought television was going to go away, but none of that happened. And in fact, today one technology platform continues to add value to another.
You touched upon Web 4 for a lot. It looks like a consolidation phase. Let me get back to that in a minute. Could we talk about Web 5 for a second? Tell
Sure.
us how Web 5 is going to be different to Web 3. and that we are using it as one of the key pillars to build Web 5.
Well, I think if you want to talk about the true future of the internet, maybe we should talk about Web 100 because I have no idea because the future is always happening, right? The future literally is unwritten as stated by the Clash back in 1983. I think Joe Stamets said that. But the point is that we're always evolving into a future. That when you're in a current state, you're not in the future. You're in the present. You're in the now. Right. And so what I'm talking about is how the now flows into the future to a point where it's truly innovative and different. So, if the current state is where we're at, I believe it's a mistake to think, gee, we're going to go into the future without ever changing, without ever evolving, that we have it perfect. And I don't believe that. So when I talk about the future, it can never be where we're at because who are we going to say that we're never going to change? That's like, I don't think so. So for me, when I look to the future of the internet and look at the next 10 years, I do think that it's the result of coexistence between the folks behind Web3 and the people living in Web 2. And again, if you want to make it, from a demographic perspective, what I'm saying is that most likely than not, if you're a Gen Z or millennial, you're living in Web 3. You may not realize it, but if the background and culture is you're more likely to be a Web 3 person than a Web 2 person. That's not to say you can't be. And people who are from the baby boomer generation and Gen X, they're most likely going to be Web 2, although they'll be offended saying, well, I'm a Web 3 person. Like, fine, so be Web 3. You could associate with all. It's almost like a personalities test. You could be whatever personality you want. It's just based on the context and based on how you're using the internet. Are you using it for business? Are you using it for personal use? Are you using it for stuff in between? And so when I look at the next 10 years, what I'm saying is that there are some people who have their blinders on and all they know about is Web 3. They don't want to talk about Web 2. They just want to talk about Web 3 only. This is all I ever do. Those people may not make it to Web 5. They may, but if they did it's because they probably changed a little bit. And the folks in Web 2 will live out their lives, maybe very happily, never touching digital assets and never worrying about stuff. However, if a company founded by a boomer or by a Gen Xer has customers that are now demographically Gen Y, Gen Z, they're going to probably have to figure out how to communicate with those folks and figure out how to do business with those folks. And that's going to drive the hybrid side of taking elements of Web3 and wrapping it so that everyone does business, because there are solutions today that help people transition from one world to the other. I'm just saying that while most people think we're in the Web3 world today, I'm happy to announce here in Coding Week 2022, no, I actually believe this moment is really Web 4. And Web 4 is a coexistence of where we're at, that we have to just take a back step and say, okay, there's a Web 3 market. And that's not the whole world. That's not all 3.5, 4 billion people that have connection to the internet. That's a part of it. And there's a Web 2 market, and that's also not everybody. And that Web 4 is coexistence of both. And what comes out of Web 2 and Web 3 coming together and coexisting will be the future, which would be Web 5. And Web 5, I may be the only person who says Web 2 and Web 3 is Web 5 and not intending to make a joke, but actually saying that it's the results of coexistence, a mutual understanding, a chance to actually look at what worked and what didn't work in these other paradigms and come up with a more efficient and more effective way to do business. I mean, arguably, running business in Web 2 through a browser is very inefficient. If you ever tried to buy anything on the internet through a browser, you realize how much time are you wasting filling out forms? How much time you're wasting by doing all these things manually? Why can't you automate it? Why can't there be some AI in there? Why can't there be some machine-to-machine communication? Why can't we validate, verify the endpoints using blockchain, saying, okay, it's me, I know it's you. We've been validated, verified. Why do we have to constantly verify, validate each other? So we can eliminate a lot of that by trusting, creating a trust system. And then all of a sudden, commerce can happen much more effectively, much more efficiently, and we don't necessarily need browsers anymore. Maybe our data, because other than our eyes looking at web pages to understand, the machines don't need to read like that, right? The machines could actually be much more effective having binary code and not text. And so, a Web 5 internet has AI in it, has lots of things in it that make that increases the efficiency of how things happen. Hopefully there's still some human elements into it as well. Hopefully it's not just machine to machine. Hopefully there are people involved in creating, but we'll see. But anyway, where we're at today, while the rest of the world thinks it's Web3 and bust, because and I say that because prior to last year, no one really made a lot of noise about the fact that the internet's evolving on the from 1994 to 2020 as a Web 1, Web 2 world. People can look back in time and say, okay, we were in the read-only internet back then because that's an easy thing to say. We're now in the interactive internet because that's an easier thing to understand. And that's when I was talking about missing state. If you're trying to do commerce, you're trying to figure out, well, where in the transaction am I? That's why people ended up with lots of cookies. It's also from a lot of companies looking for business models and looking to do advertising. People got into trouble due to privacy because they wanted to know the location where people were at, or try to understand a lot more demographic information than what a browser normally gave up. So we have lots of issues where there was exploitation of the context of where things were coming from. Putting that all aside and saying that people opt in or don't opt in to give up location, we have commerce, applications, evolution, opportunity. So where we're at today, the biggest opportunities, let us understand who we are. Let us look at what our real needs are. Let's look at the applications, what they offer today. Let's leverage those as best as we can. And then the future, which happens now too, but not this moment, that will be the Web 5 that represents the coexist, what happens when Web 2 and Web 3 coexist, communicate with each other, evolve. That is going to be the future then. And sure, there will be other shifts in time, but it's going to be, I don't believe it's Web 3 or nothing. I believe that is a mistake. Yeah. So anything other than that, however you want to get there. And so Web 4 to me is a transition state. It may last, if you look at layers of history, it's sort of like there's different layers. So Web 4 for me is the coexistence of Web 2 and Web 3, and understanding we both live together, and that Web 5 applications that leverage the best of both worlds without necessarily ever looking back, just looking forward. That's where Web 5 is. And you may start seeing Web 5 like applications coming out tomorrow, but for the most part, there's so much knowledge transfer that has to happen and so much information that needs to be given that it's going to take a lot of time for the world to catch up. So right now, welcome to Web 4.
So right now, I'd like to ask the audience to send any questions you guys have. We have few questions, so we'd like to see more of your engagement and more questions. So Jeff, talking about Web 5. So Web 3, of course, people have seen it. People are engaging with it right now. But when it comes to Web 5, people just know the buzzword. They don't know how it will be in the future, what kind of features they might have, what kind of interactions they might have, what kind of websites that might operate in Web 5. Could you go a little bit more into it?
Well, again, in Web 5, since it's not here yet, it's hard necessarily to say, but it's, in my opinion, websites go away. What we're going to see is an evolution of web to web, machine to machine learning, machine to machine communication, so that if you're putting up websites for your company, think of it more as a visual listing for people who are not machines to do searches, because searching through websites and parsing information, very inefficient. So next generation search engines will have the data it needs in order to help locate and identify what you're looking for. And that's going to be in a different context and different format than putting together some pictures, because the pictures are not for the machines to search. The pictures are for your customers to find, if your customers are using browsers to find you. I believe that over the next 10 years, browsers go away. We're moving to a much more effective, much more efficient way for discovery on the internet. New tools come up. For people who are active in the 90s on the internet, there were protocols like Gopher. I actually like Gopher and FTP and Oasis way before the World Wide Web was introduced. Just different protocols for different times. So what the evolution of the internet does require is to do a stop and rethink every once in a while, and looking at where we've come over the last 30 years. Let's see what we can create now that we never could do before. And so that will probably represent the elimination of browsers. But what it doesn't eliminate are communities. What's key to all of this is being able to bring people together, to share ideas, and to define your communities and to communicate throughout those communities. So connectivity doesn't go away. Our ability to connect, share, and engage doesn't go away, but the tools we use to do so will change. Browsers will go away. They're just very inefficient and very clumsy. Blockchain, distributed technologies doesn't go away. Our ability needs to do commerce doesn't go away either. But what we're going to end up seeing are less waste of time, if you will, and much more efficient ways of doing business. In the future, we're going to have a much more efficient way of doing business. Things that we not necessarily even see, but we just know has to be better than what we've been coping with for all this time.
Yeah. So Jeff, we touched upon smart contracts. So as far as I understand, Web3 was pioneered on smart contracts introduced on Ethereum blockchain, right? Will the
Yes.
same be utilized for Web5?
I believe that, again, it's not you have to have smart contracts for everything, but I do believe the concept of smart code with purpose, connecting to oracles or sources of truth, that will continue. That's something which we did not have in the Web 2 era. So that to me is a big innovation, being able to, and if you've ever worked as a consultant or ever had a situation where you had a financial relationship where you're supposed to be paid, being able to have the assurance to know that money that's to pay you is put in escrow, and that when the source of truth says that you delivered on the work you did, you're now paid. It changes everything. You have comfort in knowing payments will come in, and comfort knowing that you have to deliver in order to be paid, and it's very, 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 very obvious of what happens. So I think the concept of smart contracts, by the way, it's not just to blockchain. If you've ever written a line of code in your life, arguably you've written a smart contract. If you've ever written any application, depending upon the paradigm, is a so-called smart contract, because it's really code with purpose. So even if you write the word hello world, you created the so-called smart contract to deliver hello world. If there's not conditional, fine. But that's it's the language from the blockchain world may not all necessarily make it into the consumer world. That I think over time we're going to be benefiting from the innovations that blockchain brought forth, but the words will be changed to be less confusing to future consumers. Because I don't believe that all these terms were meant to be used in that way. I mean, the same way like a wallet, right? So a wallet in your pocket has all sorts of things, everything from notes to credit cards to currency, if you have currency. Sometimes it may have business cards. So in theory, your digital wallet could actually have things like that too. It just doesn't yet because it's not really mature. Also, by the way, in your wallet, you could have currencies from all different denominations. Like I travel to different worlds, different countries. I have multiple currencies. To have a digital wallet, there's an assumption that you don't necessarily have interoperability like that. So things that we take for granted as consumers don't always exist in that digital realm just yet.
So Jeff, do you think artificial intelligence, AI, would play a role in Web5 development or the features?
Yes, I mean, frankly, in Web 5, I may be here, but it may not be me. It may look like me.
That's a good concept. I think everyone heard about the introduction of Web 5 by Jack Dorsey. So he was saying that he's going to use the Bitcoin blockchain for the Web 5 instead of Ethereum that's being used for Web 3. Do you have any inputs on that?
Well, I did not know that Jack Dorsey actually got to Web 5 before I did. I'm surprised, but not that surprised knowing Jack. I mean, smart contracts do exist on Bitcoin also. I think it's a matter of semantics. Frankly, there's no blockchain today that's fast enough that would substitute for a real-time operating system. So, you look at the Visa MasterCards of the world that can handle so many transactions per second. When Visa MasterCard can run their business on blockchain, maybe you could fly your plane on blockchain. Until then, the paradigms don't line up. Also, quantum computing gets in the way sometimes too. So if Jack wants to run his Web 5, and I don't believe, again, I think that may be a mistake. I don't think it's necessarily one or the other. It's, again, continuation of coexistence. There may be chains that come into existence in the future that are much more naturally interoperable, and there may be certain digital assets that make much more sense in a converged world. I'm sure there's a reason why Jack says what he said. I would have to read his notes to understand, to decipher the in-between. But I'm not surprised. I mean, Bitcoin, look, the creation of Ethereum the white paper of Ethereum was based on the work of Satoshi in 2009. So, there's a lot of fundamentals that go back to Bitcoin. And by the way, in Unix, things are called forking. In the non-developer world, it's called copying, making a change. So one thing's fork from the other, fork to the other. So there's lots of influence, lots of coexistence of ideas from the very beginning. So if Jack is suggesting to go back to basics for Web 5 and rethink it, could be an interesting way to go. I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but I do think that in the future, the biggest challenge is being able to identify who we are, who the endpoints are that are communicating. And the other word that we haven't used today is metaverse. There is the metaverse of all, and then each world that we live inside of, whether it's a virtual world or augmented reality-driven world, some people look at each entity being a metaverse. There's a metaverse of metaverses. I think it's semantics. Other people use the word metaverse to represent the internet, that it's all encompassing, that there's one metaverse and lots of people that are parts of it rather than many metaverses. But then again, in the world of space travel and stuff, there's, many galaxies out there, not just the Milky Way galaxy. And in one galaxy, we have so many planets to explore. So it's in some cases, semantics. But in the end, I believe that we will far exceed our ability to understand what we can do until we get there. And along the way, there'll be lots of learning and lots of observations.
Yeah. So Jeff, I think we learned a lot today. There's a lot more to learn. There are a lot of concepts going on. So we learned a lot from you, from everything from Web3 to Web5. Thank you so much for your time and letting us pick your brain. I'm sure everyone enjoyed it and learned a lot and are very interested about the subject. It was a real pleasure. In last word to the audience.
Thank you for listening. Thanks for being here with us. If you didn't get a question answered, you can feel free to find me at pulver.com. I'm a pretty easy email to find. Thank you for having me today.